This is alternative political analysis, and this video will be on public policy polling in America. And Donald Trump has an approval rating of 43% and a disapproval rating of 53%. Trump's approval was 44% and his disapproval was 44%. His approval rating has decreased by 1% and his disapproval rating has increased by 9%. 52% of Americans prefer Obama to Trump, and 44% of Americans prefer Trump to Obama. 49% of Americans prefer Hillary Clinton to Trump, and 45% prefer Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton. And 46% of Americans favor impeachment of Donald Trump. 46% of Americans oppose impeachment of Donald Trump. 66% of Americans think the United States are safe, and 23% of Americans think the United States are not safe, and 45% of Americans support Trump's immigration order. 49% of Americans are opposed to Trump's immigration order. And among people who support Trump's immigration order, 51% said that the Bowling Green massacre shows the order was needed, whereas 23% of those who support the order disagreed with that. And for more information on the actual Bowling Green massacre, look up the alternative political analysis video titled The Bowling Green Massacre. And 48% of Americans thought his order was a Muslim ban. 43% of Americans said they thought it was not a Muslim ban. 22% of Americans support the concept of a Muslim ban, and 65% of Americans are opposed to the concept of a Muslim ban, and 27% of Americans thought Trump's immigration order was well implemented, and 66% of Americans thought implementation of the order was poor, and 53% of Americans trust the judiciary more than they trust Trump. 38% of Americans trust Donald Trump more than they trust the judiciary, and 25% of Americans think Trump should be able to overrule the judiciary. 64% of Americans think that Donald Trump should not be able to overrule the judiciary. And this brings us on to opinion on Trump's staff. 22% of Americans approve of Steve Bannon. 45% of Americans disapprove of Steve Bannon. 34% of Americans approve of Kellyanne Conway. 47% of Americans disapprove of Kellyanne Conway. 32% of Americans approve of Sean Spicer. 41% of Americans disapprove of Sean Spicer. 27% of Americans approve of Betsy DeVos. 49% of Americans disapprove of Betsy DeVos. And this brings us on to the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. 47% of Americans support it. 39% of Americans oppose it. 65% of Americans support reform. 32% of Americans support repeal. And 53% of Americans support mandatory candidate tax release. 32% of Americans oppose mandatory candidate tax release. 58% of Americans want Trump to publish his tax details. 31% of Americans think Trump shouldn't publish his tax details. And 62% of Americans want Donald Trump to divest from his business interests. 27% think that he should not be compelled to. And this brings us on to the subject of the Russian Federation. And 13% of Americans are Russophilic, and 63% of Americans are Russophobic. And Vladimir Putin has a 10% approval rating in the United States and a 72% disapproval rating in the United States. And this brings us on to the relative popularity of Donald Trump and Mike Pence. And when those surveyed were asked whether they would prefer Trump or Pence as president, 38% said they would prefer Trump, 30% said they would prefer Pence. And when they were asked who is more credible between Donald Trump and the New York Times, 52% said the New York Times were more credible, and 37% said Donald Trump was more credible. And this brings us on to the border and immigration. 37% of Americans support the wall. 56% of Americans oppose the wall. 32% of Americans support a 20% Mexico tariff. 55% of Americans are opposed to such a tariff. 28% of Americans think millions of illegal immigrants voted. 56% don't think millions of illegal immigrants voted. And for more information on that, there is a video on Trump's claim on this YouTube channel. And this brings us on to the subject of American opinion on Australia. 76% of Americans have a favourable opinion of Australia. 5% of Americans have an unfavourable opinion on Australia. And this brings us on to US opinion on Mexico. 7% of Americans support invading Mexico. 83% of Americans would oppose invading Mexico. And that concludes the opinion of the American public according to the latest public policy polling survey. And I would recommend that viewers check out the Alternative Political Analysis YouTube channel, Facebook page and blog for more interesting videos and posts.